So welcome to a new book talk organized by European Center for Populism Studies. I'm Hafsa Girdap and I will be moderating today's book talk. First of all, let me introduce you the author of the book, Liberal Roots of Far-Right Activism, the Anti-Islamic Movement in the 21st Century, which we'll be discussing today. Lars Erik Berntzen. I hope I'm pronouncing the names perfectly, correctly. Dr. Berntzen is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen and affiliate researcher at the Center for Research on Extremism. He received his doctoral degree in political and social sciences from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy in 2018. And his work covers the far right, political violence, and mass polarization. And we have a discussant, Dr. Aaron Winter. Dr. Winter is Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of East London, and his research is on the far right with a focus on racism, mainstreaming, and violence. Thank you both for joining us today. And Dr. Berntzen will now talk about his book, and after that we'll hear from Dr. Winter regarding his reflections on the book. And at the end of their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session in which we will not only ask questions, but also share our thoughts, ideas, and remarks. Dr. Berntzen, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me for this discussion. It's greatly appreciated. I can start, I think. So I could say my academic career so far has revolved around, in principle, really the 22nd of July terrorist attacks that occurred in Norway in 2011, when the right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik committed two quite devastating terrorist attacks, killing 77, most of them, minors, and injuring many more. This book is one of the outcomes of that research process. So that was one of the sort of founding motivations for the work that I've done. And I could say that my book does two things. First, it maps the evolution of a substantial section of the far right, starting out from Western Europe and then going beyond that. And second, it delves into what I think is, at least from a bird's eye perspective, a very striking paradox. But to set the stage a little bit, I think we can start, like I do in the book, by turning back the clock to the 1990s and direct our attention to Western Europe and what was going on there. And for one, you had a substantial presence of skinhead neo-Nazis marching on the streets, right? And there was a wave of violence against asylum seekers, massively so in Germany, but also in several Western European countries. And if we turn to more organized party politics, what you had quite openly and brazenly were far-right politicians and activists that were, railing against and venting their anger and scorn towards immigrants in general, homosexuals, and feminists. And then if we jump forward in time, only a couple of years, so from the start of the 2000s, what we saw then was still what we could characterize as this sort of resurgent far right. But by then, a lot of prominent activists and politicians were talking quite warmly about gender equality, gay rights, and about the Jewish minority and this notion of a Judeo-Christian civilization. And all of this, they claimed, was facing an existential threat from Islam and the Muslim minority in Western Europe and in the so-called Western civilization. And in a historical perspective, if we take an historical perspective, hearing far-right politicians and activists talk in these terms is confounding to a certain extent, you could say, right? Given the historical legacy of opposition towards progressive and liberal ideas, values, and the whole gamut of minorities, be it ethnic, sexual, and so on, then the question is that the far right, which has been so hostile to these groups and these values, have they now become their sort of guardians, defenders? This is the kind of theme that runs through the book and what I investigate substantially. And I do this in several different manners. So I always try to pursue this question: so how deep does this run? Because if we simplify it, which if we want to put it to the point, there are two binary opposite alternatives. Either it's a facade, it's something that they use as a rhetorical tool to justify and sort of cover up their otherwise more classical anti-Semitism and straightforward racism that we associate with the historical fascist and extreme right. Or it's something that runs deeper than that. It's more than a facade, and it's something that perhaps genuinely they believe, right? And I investigate this across a whole range of areas. So I look at these intellectuals and activists, the figureheads and the leaders of these activist groups that mobilize against Islam and against Muslims, their backgrounds, political backgrounds and trajectories, and the ideological platforms of the organizations that they run. And then I go beyond that and I look at their online presence. I look at their organizational networks on Facebook, and also amongst the more ordinary members, so to speak, of their Facebook groups. I look at what they espouse, what they say, and also what messages drives engagement on their Facebook groups. So it's a mix of analysis of documents and some interviews, qualitative work with more large N network analysis and standard regression analysis of content and so on. And what I find is quite consistently, that these nominally liberal and progressive, positions and values are quite consistently present, and that's, I would say, rather striking. And you could extrapolate based on that into quite different directions. I'll return to that. But contrary, I would say, to the dominant perspective in a lot of the existing academic literature on the topic, I do find then that their embrace of these some of these liberal and progressive positions is something more than a facade. What that something more is, you would really substantially need more data on than and more information on than I've got or that I do present in the book, right? because still you could say my studies kind of stops at just beyond the surface level to a certain extent. But my main argument here is that, well, what we have seen since the turn of and the start of the 2000s is the advent of a rather, you could say, a rather new movement, right? And a movement that has its roots not in the old, fascist far right, but outside. So if you look to the leaders, a lot of them have their background either on the left or the conservative right, and they all espouse this support for a lot of these values and positions that we associate with liberalism, and also some progressive positions, things that have been fought for historically by what we describe as the left, a lot of them. And I think the character Hege Storhaug in Norway, she epitomizes this evolution that we've seen. And she was from the 90s onwards, she was a rather prominent figure in the Norwegian public, self-described feminist, that then came into contact with some Pakistani women, and she became devoted to their cause, and gradually then over time, in light of 9/11 and the so-called Muhammad cartoon crisis, her position morphed and you could say radicalized, and she became completely obsessed with Islam, which she, as so many others in this movement, see as a totalitarian ideology, equate with Nazism and communism, and that superseded with time all her other positions, and so now she's come to embrace, figures such as Viktor Orban and Putin and so on. These strongmen leaders that also, at least for Viktor Orban, claim to be defenders of Western civilization against the threat of Islam and so on. But they also, they're not only opposed to Islam and Muslim immigration and what have you, but they also stamp down on other minorities and civil freedoms, civil rights, and so on. So you could say that over time, this movement has gone in a ever more authoritarian and illiberal direction. But a lot of the starting point for many has been precisely within the confines of liberalism, you could say. So what you've had here is what you can describe as this sort of radicalization of mainstream values, right? So that's one of the, so you have several potential takeaways from what I find, but I believe one is crucial that I don't really develop it so much in the book, I would say, but the takeaway, one important takeaway, I think, is that principles, which are embraced by society at large in Western Europe, and then thought of as, benevolent and benign, and also to a certain extent safeguards against authoritarianism, against extremism, might in fact be the sort of motivator for precisely authoritarianism and extremism, right? So what you can see here is that it sort of revolves around this paradox of tolerance, right? And a lot of these individuals have then, in their perspective, to combat what they see as the ultimate manifestation of intolerance, they've become ever more intolerant themselves. So this is part of the story. And then the other part of the story is, of course, the old established, radical and extreme right that have also gone through this process. So you've had a convergence between, people coming from, the mainstream, as it were, and people coming from the far right, and over time a convergence, so that by now the two are more or less indistinguishable. So some factions within the radical to extreme right have shed some of their, open opposition to democracy and other minorities, non-Muslim minorities. And this has been quite well documented in the political science literature and so on. What I have been documenting in the book, and what I discuss there, is the opposite process, that they have embraced more and more authoritarian positions and nativist positions that we associate with the far right, and that we indeed use to classify and define what is far right and what is not far right. So I think I'll end it there. I think I've almost run out of time.
Yeah, that was a great summary. Thank you. And we'll come back to you with questions. I'm sure that people have questions. I have questions. So now, Dr. Winter, the floor is yours. We are really excited to hear from you, your discussion, your reflections.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Hafsa and Populism Studies, and of course, Lars, for the invitation to participate in this event for Liberal Roots of Far-Right Activism, the Anti-Islamic Movement in the 21st Century. It is an honor and a welcome opportunity. Having worked in far-right studies, broadly defined, for the past 2 decades, what has always struck me is the way in which the far right, and with it their racism, is not only constructed as a threat to liberalism and our peaceful, settled liberal democracies, but that the latter serve as a bulwark against the far right and racism. In this construction, an oft-repeated narrative, which itself dates back to, at least, the defeat of Nazism and the post-war liberal democratic order, and the emergence of the radical right theorists during the post-war Cold War and civil rights era in the US. The inequalities and injustices within liberalism and liberal democracy not only often escape scrutiny, but are displaced onto and projected onto the far right, and the illiberal past that we are so beyond, or its remnants in the far extreme or radical right, and are thus allowed to continue and flourish with the status quo relatively undisturbed. For example, mainstream values as liberal, tolerant, and progressive. Notably, racism and the ways in which the far right allows for it to be seen and represented as exceptional, external, and extreme, as opposed to something embedded in this ideology and system, systemic, structural, or institutional, and when needed, politically expedient, albeit in less illiberal and extreme forms, and more liberal or moderate forms and articulations. Border control as opposed to repatriation. Hence, it also tends to ignore the more systemic forms of mainstreaming. This is far-right studies I'm referring to, unless it is official far-right parties getting votes, a very political science metric, as opposed to ideas, calculations by mainstream parties, and the effects of such policies, rhetoric, and the far right itself, notably around Islam and immigration. It also, this focus or this defense of liberalism and liberal democracy by the mainstream and by far-right studies can also help squeeze out the left and more radical anti-racism, and crucially move the political center as the savior of democracy to the right. This relationship between the far right and liberalism and function of the former for the latter is the basis of my intervention and work with Aurélien Mondon in our work, Reactionary Democracy, Articulations of Islamophobia, and our concepts of liberal and illiberal and liberal racism. We see this most acutely in the context of Islamophobia, which we see as key to understanding the mainstreaming of the far right, where liberal values are often weaponized, not just against the far right as illiberal, but Islam as illiberal and Muslims as illiberal, around women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, tolerance, and free speech, where we see liberal democracies and liberalisms as a bulwark against not just the far right, but against Islam and Muslims. Opening the door to not only liberal racism against Muslims, that is saved only insofar as it's not as bad as illiberal fascism. It's not as bad as the treatment which would be meted out by the far right. We also see, though, because through this free speech platforming of the far right in a sort of both sides objectivity, or crucially, legitimizing the anti-Muslim racism and even the authoritarian controls that the far right itself seeks. For us, it is about mainstreaming the far right and racism more broadly, and the role of liberalism in that, despite its own protestations. And this brings me, of course, to liberal roots of far-right activism. Considering my critique of liberalism, it will come as no surprise that the title caught my attention when it came out and was seen, I saw it as a very, very welcome and important contribution. In some ways, I feel that although we are having a dialogue now, in some ways we are already in dialogue, the books and our work, mapping and analyzing similar phenomena and issues. So thanks again for this opportunity. Now, I'm not claiming that we have the same argument or analysis or conclusions, nor methods or theoretical underpinnings, or look at the same context and phenomenon exactly. I think in some ways, these are contributions to a wider discussion that needs to be had. Although we do share Western Europe and North America as context, it is worth noting in terms of far-right racism and specifically what is termed anti-Islamic activism, I come to this also not just as a scholar of the far right, but as a scholar of sociology and history of racism, including anti-Muslim racism. And so, again, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I learned a lot. It got me really thinking, and I think it's a really, really vitally important contribution. So thank you. I was particularly impressed by the rigorous methods and the use of network analysis and sentiment analysis, bringing something different to the table. The case studies and mapping of actors and ideologies, which made great reading, but also important stories and analysis. I was particularly impressed and interested in the liberal roots thesis and the focus on liberalism, which, as I noted, is so often the unspoken normative standpoint of far-right studies. The transnational focus for both the analysis, the comparative analysis within it and potential for it, which is something very near and dear to my heart, but also the movement thesis that it forms a transnational movement. It's something I sort of want to discuss a little further. The focus on activism as opposed to political parties and elections primarily. And the link between such activism and wider social currents and the mainstream. Historical change, the focus on the shift from sort of skinheads and neo-Nazism to not only anti-Muslim activism, but crucially liberalism. And again, the anti-Islam character and focus. All, I think, very important things. And things I think in some way I've actually been calling for a lot out of far-right studies over the years. And so again, thank you for the book. There are a few aspects that caught my attention and questions that I would like to ask. So apologies, in some ways I'm responding to things, but I also have more questions, if that's okay. Some out of interest, some seeking clarification, while others comments from I guess I don't know if I can call myself a critical friend. I will try to ask them, even if answered in the book in some way, as some attending may not have read or digested all parts or focused in on these. First, a few about Islamophobia. Now, the focus is 2001, and I guess I'd asked how much you see this as a real clear shift, and I think you've already answered that, Lars. But I guess I would wonder how and where does Islamic activism and ideas, how is it related to these earlier racisms and sort of enmities of the far right? How is it related to the previous anti-asylum seeker and anti-immigrant discourses and enmities, if also some of those overlap quite significantly? Like many of the asylum seekers and immigrants are Muslim. But also older historical anti-Semitism in the way in which the sort of the racialization and the religious hatred intermingle and almost allow racists in the far right and out. That they're talking about ideas and beliefs, not people. So I guess I'd ask that. But also older colonial, notably anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-North African, anti-Pakistani racism and Orientalism that has occupied the imagination of the far right in many countries. I mean, particularly in France with the Front National. Following up from this, do you think this is an adaptation for the far right strategically, a response to contingent conditions, or do you think it's going to be a long-term focus? Do you think liberalism and anti-Muslim hatred and racism is going to be the focus significantly for a long time? I asked this primarily because, and I think you pointed to this as well, when I was doing research on the American far right post 9/11, the focus, the illiberalism of the far right was matched with the so-called illiberalism of Islamism. And there was a convergence, if not an alliance thesis operating. So the idea that the far right would become anti-Muslim, I think, took a lot of particularly Islamophobic neoconservatives by surprise. Not that they didn't feed that phenomenon. Now, do you think the liberal roots go back further? In a sense, what me and Aurelian discuss is the imperialism, colonialism, and racism of liberalism historically. So maybe in some ways this is not necessarily a paradox or contradiction, but one possible route through liberalism. I have like a ton of other questions. Do you want me to go through them or do you want to respond? It's up to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Maybe I can begin. I don't know, Hafsa, what do you?
Yeah, of course.
It's really great to have you, Aaron, as a sort of a sparring partner on this, and I really can appreciate yes, that we've studied more or less to a certain extent the same phenomenon, but reached partially overlapping conclusions, but also diverged a little bit. And for me, it's a little bit. I have this analytical in my head sort of separation between the book and the argument that I present there and what are my views and how they've developed, because they've developed a bit further, and I'm not as sort of stringent, as it were, now as I was, I suppose, then, in some respects. But my aim in the book was very much sort of analytical clarity. Yeah, so Islamophobia first, and I think maybe although I don't want to, jump ahead too much, but Hafsa, you said that you wanted to discuss that also. First, is it a real clear shift? Yeah, and I mean, it's a tricky question, right? Because I would say both yes and no. On the one end, and this is sort of the case that I make in the book, is that, well, Islamophobia sort of consists of two elements. It's the anti-Islamic element and the anti-Muslim element, and you can distinguish and pull those two apart sort of analytically. Although in reality, on the streets, as it were, or they intermingle and overlap. I distinguish then between, so the anti-Islamic is the perception of Islam as this totalitarian ideology, right? And then you have the sort of anti-Muslim perceptions, expressions that are very much, you could say, racist, and build on quite explicitly these racist tropes. And when you've got all these sort of the memes and the cartoons that they make are, to my reading, very much, a lot of them are direct continuations or build on these racist tropes from what I know, particularly from the US, with African Americans and so on, and these sexualized notions of Muslims as which you of course also have a lot of work now on about on love jihad, right, in India. I'm not providing a clear answer here now. I could tell. But I think that racialization is a very, very, very prominent feature here. But it's not what I devote my attention to primarily in the book. Yeah.
So, Aaron, if you don't mind, I want to jump into that discussion that you were talking about, Islamophobia, which is more, comprehensive term that includes both anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic approaches or ideologies. I inferred that you favored anti-Islam just because it's more ideological, which covers or which hides the hypocrite approaches of far right, which seems semi-liberal instead of semi-authoritarian, so that they are not focusing on the identities or the individuals, but the problematic ideologies which are not compatible with democracy, with human rights. Is that correct? This is my inference. I know it's a bit complicated.
I'm not quite sure if I got like the nuance of your question, so I might be,
So I was trying to understand your reason, your mindset that you were favoring anti-Islam instead of Islamophobia and instead of anti-Muslim in the research.
Yes,
I'm not mistaken, right? That's what you did.
I do. That's what. So I put anti-Islamic, the title and so on, and consistently use it. I consistently use it, and in my subsequent work, I still tend personally to shy away from the label Islamophobia, but I now consistently use anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic in the same sort of utterance. But in the book, I make the case. I argue that, well, at the sort of organizational level, what is the primary ideological driver and motivation is the opposition and the view of Islam as this totalitarian opponent, right? And that's what they at that organizational level base their opposition on and their mobilization on. And then at the individual level, it can very well quite often be the direct opposite, so that it's primarily based on this sort of aversion to the other, the Muslim other, and this racialized perception of Muslims. So at the individual level, that might very well, for a lot of these people who engage, be the primary driver. And then that shifts when you look at the organization. And then you could, of course, you could make the claim that focusing on the and using the label itself, anti-Islamic, sort of covers up that. That's certainly not my intention in the book as such. But I do think that there is merit to describing them as anti-Islamic and as an anti-Islamic movement. But it all depends on your sort of analytical viewpoint, and then of course you've got overlapping and other sort of ethical concerns, normative concerns that from the background that I've come from, it's been a sort of a goal to disentangle those. And then the question, of course, which is a sort of recurring debate, is, well, is that sort of possible, and what are the implications of when you do that? And I know Aaron, for instance, has been engaging in substantially with those points. But was that a sufficient answer to your question or your input there?
Yeah, but I don't know if Aaron thinks the same.
Coincidentally, that was actually my next question or comment. Was actually about these distinctions.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about it also in terms of this weird balance you've got to make between dealing with the self-definition and self-identity of the actors that you're studying, and particularly when they are ideological and their self-definition identity is functional, right? And serves some political purpose. And then defining it as yourself, both for rigorous academic purposes, but also for political reasons, like why you would want to use the term like why you'd want to use the term sort of fascist and not populist, for example, right? Like what would the implications of that would be? And so I was going to note that, like, even when I'm talking about the book, my terms are changing: Islamophobia, anti-Muslim, and there's a reason for that I know in my own head. If I'm thinking about how I would describe something, and I'm talking about how you would, right, or how the media would, and I guess I wanted to ask about that, and maybe you've answered part of it, acknowledging again that there's no perfect or uncontested term. I mean, we could get into far versus radical versus extreme right versus populist versus radical right, authoritarian populist, which at some point I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. But the term anti-Islamic, now the dominant term in some ways might be more problematic, Islamophobia. But there is a consensus on this, which is also why I've chosen to use that term, even though I'm never comfortable with it. And often I always get someone on Twitter going, but am I phobic? And them obviously identifying with anti-Islam, but they're contesting this phobia thing. Anti-Islam or anti-Islamic, on the other hand, is often juxtaposed or opposed to anti-Muslim in sort of political discussions as well. Anti-Muslim denoting the targets are and effects are on people. And it's for this reason that anti-Muslim is often followed by racism, denoting the racialization of Muslims, but not a denial that they are also a religious community or communities, more accurately. Where anti-Islam is often the term the far right and racists give themselves to deny racism and pretend it's about religion and ideas. Tommy Robinson would be a great example, someone who often euphemistically, which is a huge problem in mainstreaming, is identified as an anti-Islam activist, as if he is targeting a religion and not people, but also he's an activist as opposed to an extremist or a racist, which also untethers activism from its more radical associations in history. The focus on Islam as opposed to Muslims is also And I'm not saying in your work it is at all, but it also is the language and discourse of liberal Islamophobia, in that it subjects Muslims and their beliefs, culture, social relations, family relations, etc., to constant free debate, as if these are just ideas that are subject to the marketplace of ideas. And as if it's about liberal values, such as free speech, as opposed to people and the harms to them. In that, the fact that it is a religion plays a role. But as in all racisms, it's people being subject to dehumanizing discussion and debate. And I guess it's for this reason I want to open up discussion of definitions and ask where you see liberalism in the definitional debate about Islamophobia, anti-Islamic, or anti-Muslim. Like, if you see it's not just a label or a term, but also it relates to your liberal thesis. And I guess going back to the whole kind of the divide between anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim, I keep on coming back to the Islamization of Europe and Islamization of America. And as if anyone who pretends it's about religion and culture sees these as possible without people, particularly when they're also linking it to immigration control. I guess I would just ask that. Yeah.
So before you answer, Lars, I want to say that the audience can ask questions, and I see a question in the chat box. After you answer Aaron's question, we can go ahead and answer them too. Okay, Lars, thank you.
Yeah. You know, it's a big sort of topic and box to delve into. And I can say that one of the, you know, there are a lot of reasons to you know, I mean, it's a discussion well worth having, I would say. Often, certainly amongst academics, we often, you know, people express you know, being, you know, over it and tired of these sort of debates. And I can sympathize, and I've sometimes, you know, been there myself and feel that, but whenever we do start discussing it, and I sort of have to refresh my, you know, positions and memory, I do think quite consistently that it's always a discussion worth having about these concepts, you know, and their merits depending on what you focus on. And if you take sort of the, you know, perspective of who is being targeted, who is being victimized, then focusing on the anti-Muslim component and highlighting that certainly makes more sense, right? So there is that. And looking at, yeah, and also, you know, at the if the focus is the sort of the you know, the racism and the prejudice as such, and a lot of these, there is also the tension here that, you know, it's an ongoing moving target. You have people engaging and, you know, trying to sort of dominate the narrative and you know, gain power. So people use terms such as anti-Islam and, you know, yeah, activist, and they define themselves for a long time, most of these groups, including the English Defence League in England and Britain, and Tommy Robinson, you know, as human rights organizations. And that's also a line, you know, that courses through what we define as the far right over the last couple of decades. You know, that they focus, they're defenders of human rights of various kinds, you know, and that's quite fascinating. And from the literature on social movements and what is called, you know, master frames, that's been one of the findings / claims, that is that arising from the civil rights movement in the US, you've had this master frame of the rights frame, or the defense of minority rights frame, in a sense, that other people have, they peel away all the other substance, and then you're left with that core, and then that can be used by pretty much any other stream of politics, and for their own projects. And that is, in this case, very much what's been going on. And I draw it up as an opposition between, genuine and strategic. But of course, in reality, you have this, people can utilize words and tropes for strategic purposes, but also embrace them to a certain extent. Although that's open also for critique, right? But when you talk about, okay, so they're talking about gender equality. Well, hey, if you shift the perspective and you look at another situation, suddenly they're opposed to feminism, and mobilize against certainly newer varieties of feminism. So they kind of stick more to the notion that, well, we've already sort of crossed the finish line. We've made it. This is what defines Western society, civilization, liberal society, is that men and women are free to participate equally. So you have this constant struggle, a political clash that's going on, that is, in this area of study, is really, really quite fundamental. So that we have to deal with, right? So yeah. So I think because then that answers certainly, or partly, to what Aaron also asked earlier on. So is it strategic or not, right? And I would say both yes and no. You have people who came into this from a sort of non-strategic angle, but then they can certainly utilize as a sort of this shield their other positions to justify, anti-Muslim attitudes and actions, right? As well. Yeah, sort of all over the place a little bit with my answers again, but yeah.
So there is a question in the, actually there are two questions, but I'm gonna ask in the order that they are asked. So they thank you for this interesting discussion. And the question is that, could you see any parallelism or correlation between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? And do you think whether Muslim immigrants are true reason for this rising far-right extremism and populist radical right movements, or the Muslim immigrants are only exploited as pretext and they are just targets of far-right enmity in current times?
Well, the question then is, so okay, what would you have if say this sort of alternative reality scenario? You don't have Muslim immigration to the West, and you don't have a lot of things happening. Maybe you don't have the fall of the Soviet Union, or what have you, right? What would sort of politics be like, and who would be sort of targeted, right, and seen as the main threat? So I think a lot of the developments that we have seen have been contingent on a lot of historical facts, and for instance the 9/11 attacks. Without them, I think we would have had some of these developments, but they certainly wouldn't have been so pronounced. 9/11 was this game changer, I would say, absolutely, in a lot of domains. So I don't think it would have manifested itself in the same extent without these things, but it would have certainly been present, I think. but as we see now in subsequent years, is that sort of re-emergence again of the old white supremacists, white nationalists in the U.S. and also in some Western European countries, what we can call quite openly, fascist entities re-emerge. I think to a certain extent that's been overstated. It's not the dominant, phenomenon. It's still, this the anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic mobilization that's predominant in Western Europe. The whole scene is a lot more muddled in the United States. You've got a lot of different historical, trajectory strands of the what we call the far right. But I think it would have targeting of Muslims would have occurred regardless. But would it have occurred based on and motivated explicitly based on their ethnicity, separate from their Muslim identity? Or would it be because of their Muslim identity? And I think it would have been more of a direct continuation of what we saw earlier in the 90s, 80s, and so on, right? That the pretext was, the difference based on ethnicity, on nationality, and so on, in a much more clear-cut way than it has been over the last 2 decades, certainly. If that was an answer.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you. And another question, it's directly come to me. When we think of demand and supply aspects of populism regarding the rise of Islamophobia, do you see any Islamic movements, civil society organizations in the West who distinguish themselves from the radical interpretation of Islam? And by the way, you can, turn your videos on and jump into the discussion. I'm telling the audience, please, feel free. Did you get that?
The last one was so supply and demand, but then whether or not the presence or absence, I guess, of can you reiterate the last part of that question?
Professor, do you want to ask your question on your own?
I'm not expert on Islam. I'm not also expert on populist literature on Islam, but I define myself as a Muslim individual. I would like to hear about your idea, because you are working on the topics. I wonder to see or hear if there are some communities living in the West, Muslim communities, NGO activities, social networks, who clearly distinguish themselves from the fundamentalist radical interpretation of Islam, if they put a distance between themselves and those movements activities, in a way that we can legitimize their situation in the West, that they are not against pluralism, democracy, human rights, etc. The reason that I am asking this question is that those radical people who has a fundamentalist view of Islam can easily live within those kind of communities, although they criticize those terrorist activities, radical interpretation of Islam, but at the end of the day, those people can easily still integrate with those societies and still live with them. They could not easily exclude them, isolate them, continue living together. But at the same time, they say, no, we are against those extremist views. We are pro-democracy, human rights, etc. It seems to me that there is a chaotic situation here.
Well, thank you. I mean, on that, I think somebody else than myself should step in and provide. I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to answer that, because that hasn't been my focus as such. My focus has been on the mobilization against Muslims and against Islam in Western Europe and the United States, North America, primarily, right? And but from the literature that I know on the subject and what I've been following, if we're talking about sort of tensions between within the Muslim minority community, because I think that's what you were getting at, right? In a way, then certainly. Yes, that is present, as far as I know, quite substantially so. And whether or not sort of the more open, the more pluralist oriented Muslims, if they sort of take a stand. I think that was what you were asking about. Take a stand against people of a Muslim conviction who espouse a fundamentalist view and anti-pluralist view, right? Then I think, yeah. So in that struggle, yeah. I mean, it's an ongoing struggle, and it's not something that's very. It's not something that's very prominent, in the overall public debate as such. So it's in society about these tensions or and struggles over. But I mean, it's present. That's just my 2 cents. So I to be honest, I don't think I can provide you a very good answer. I'm sorry on that. Maybe the others.
Maybe Mr. Vinton would like to have some comments on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of overstep and take over. It is Lars event. I mean, I guess I would just say just my 2 cents. I think it's important not to see Muslim communities within this frame. I think people are just living their lives. I don't think people are either for or against. Like it's not all about the worst people that we need to organize and identify ourselves around. And I think it's important. I think in some ways, the idea that Muslims have to stand up and take a stand to prove that they are for democracy, pluralism, tolerance, etc., is feeding right into the far right. That's the far right hands. We don't subject white people. We don't subject like white British people to that test all the time. And that actually that is a manifestation of the racist system that actually continuously, I mean, Islamophobia is very, the gasoline, the petrol of Islamophobia is also the ability to objectify and separate Muslims and subject them to a purity or a loyalty test. And I think we have to resist that. That's where I would, that's my kind of 2 cents. Sorry.
Thanks.
There is another question, and I guess it's the last one, but again, I'm saying that you can jump into the discussion, share your thoughts, opinions, or ask your questions. And I'm going to ask the question in the chat box. In what ways the liberal state in Western European countries are legitimizing the far-right anti-Islam views by their policies of immigration? That's a great question. Actually, it was in my mind too, especially by the obligatory training asylum seekers and immigrants have to go through in order to receive legal status and citizenship.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's also, it could be the starting point of a very long discussion that as well. I think the point could be made. So if it's a sort of a pro contra, if you on that, I think certainly you could make the claim that it's plays into, as Aaron said about the other point, that it plays sort of into the hands of the people who mobilize most explicitly against Muslims and against the presence of Muslims in Western Europe. And there are these sort of value tensions, right? And then the gist of it is that, to a certain extent, you could say, the hostility towards Muslims is predicated on for a large section of the Western European populace. It's predicated on this perception of Muslims as a homogeneous entity that are fundamentally extremely conservative, right? And so that's what it's predicated on, and that's also what, to a certain extent, the system is built around. That is sort of that Muslims represent a minority that on a whole range of issues are so different from the majority population that they are, quote unquote, how do you pronounce that in English? Unintegrationable, maybe. I think that's, yeah. And so of course that that sort of view does reinforce, and to a certain extent sort of to legitimize, the far right perspective of Muslims as this kind of Islamizing force hell-bent on changing society into Sharia states and so on.
Yeah.
If
Anyone?
that was an answer.
Yeah.
But again, I think now that so many of you who are here could also provide, direct answers that,
Sure.
so feel free to step in.
Anyone who wants to chime in? Yes, Semiha, she raised her hand.
Yeah, I actually want to contribute to my question and your answer, in the sense that it was actually particularly about Norway and the classes that the immigrants or the asylum seekers were put through, especially on gender. Like, they were taught, like, this is how you treat a woman. This is how you kind of talk to a woman, and those kinds of humiliating classes that they were put to sit in order to receive their legal status. And these people were, as you said, from all these different countries and backgrounds, and probably living very secular lives back in their home countries, but are treated as fundamentalists in this official discourse. So, and the way you said that the far right is being mainstreamed by the way of these liberal discourses and these actors, including the state in this case. So I kind of wanted to explain that this is particularly something I saw in the case of Norway, which is thought to be very tolerant in that sense, kind of, for their immigration policies, but coming with these understanding that we need to train these Muslims to be able to integrate it into the Western society.
Yeah, so you have different components to that. So on one level, you've got sort of this sort of empirical question, and that is, is there a gap? Is there an actual gap? And how substantial is it, right? And for how many people is that gap there, right? And then there are the implications for the people who are then sort of pushed through that system, and what that does to them. For instance, you highlighted, I forget the word you used, but humiliation, I think, right? So the effects that, for instance, in terms of humiliation that can have, and how that can, have long-term impacts on a human being. So there are a lot of these. Not necessarily competing positions, but they're certainly pushing that mandatory system, and having that kind of straightforward sort of training of, so this is how we act, and this is how you should act now, and that sort of underlying assumption that that is not how the people who enter into society as immigrants or refugees, that is not how they think, that is not how they act, and so on. Yeah, I can certainly see that that is a a dehumanizing process in that sense. So and that's the kind of the one of the potential takeaways from my book. It goes back to that, is that, well, it's the distinction between what is now we describe as the far right and what we describe as the majority or mainstream society is not always, and particularly in this regard, it's not very clear cut, right? So the edges aren't that sharp, and that's what, so it's not something that lurks in the shadows, right? It's not like the idea of that neo-Nazi with the swastika, running around in military kind of outfits. That certainly creates this picture of a sort of an outsider as well, that it's not part of society as such. This is the kind of the rejects of society, the failures, the has-beens, right? Whereas the case in point is that, or the actual fact of the matter is that, this is broadly speaking, middle-class individuals in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that act and claim to be acting on behalf of society as such, not on notions of necessarily of say like race pure society or something like that. Which of course in Western Europe and the United States, there's been an active mobilization against, as Aaron pointed out, since the Second World War, where you had that sort of the origins of that process. So it's sort of finicky in that sense, right? Because that's what it touches on, is that there's this self-perception of benevolence in a way, right? Whereas a lot of and then when you see something that surfaces in the public, it's easy to sort of focus on the most sort of different element of it, right? So with the far right in question, tend to focus on sort of the most extreme individuals, the most extreme acts, and so on. For instance, from some kind of demonstration, and say, oh, well, that's not us, right? These are the that's a very small minority, and so on. So you have that tension, and it's in a way, it's the mirror image, and also sort of an opposite of what's been going on, with when majority society has been discussing, how Muslims should respond as Muslims in the wake of a jihadi terror attack, for instance, right? So you have a lot of these parallels, and sort of in some respects the same response, but and in some respects the very opposite response. Yeah. Okay, I'm going a bit too far ahead again, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I think we are running out of time. Let's take the last person, if you don't mind, and Smeye.
Yeah, I don't know if it is going to be the short question or not, but I'm just curious about the reception of the book. Lars, for you also, Dr. Winter, yours, the reactionary democracy. I'm very curious about how your thoughts have been changing since you both published your books and the responses you received. and how it affects your current research projects, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, my thinking has changed in a lot of ways since writing that. But I can say that with the response to what I've been writing, let's see, by the people that I've been studying themselves, I can say first, is that the response has been, a little bit mixed, because on the one hand, they clamor for and desire the attention, right? And then when there's something that they disagree with, they sort of violently go against that. But in other, when it comes to other things, they've sort of embraced some of the stuff that I've written and co-authors have written and utilized that. And that was particularly now. So now it's been a decade since the 22nd of July terrorist attacks, and so me and a co-author published a different study, an article about the far-right responses to Anders Behring Breivik and the attacks and how they've reacted. And the predominant response was one of rejection by what we describe as radical right politicians and parties in Western Europe, but also the extreme right in Western Europe. So it was one of vilification of Breivik and saying, well, he's a monster, he doesn't represent us, right? And that's pushing away. Whereas you had an embrace of Breivik and the terror attacks by the extreme right in Russia, and subsequently now in the United States, also with these kind of fascist communities that are also into and idolizing school shootings and so on. But the predominant response was this sort of distancing and rejection, and we go into the reasons for that and discuss the various reasons for that. But that finding in and of itself was, of course, they all embraced that, right? And they took that as the key point, and then they said, well, you see here, there wasn't any reason for you to, lambast us, don't critique us. We've always, distanced ourselves from Breivik and the attacks. So that fed directly into the ongoing sort of political struggle that they are engaging in. So that was something that just happened, and I'm currently writing a piece on that and reflections on that, and then I could say, going to the book again, so you can take some of the findings and the arguments that I make in different directions. One of the directions you could take it is to say, well, this isn't such a bad phenomenon. That's one of the directions you could take. So what we call the far right, they're quite they're not as bad as people say, again, right? Or that scholars say. So that's one of the directions, and that was hinted at in one of the book reviews. Sort of what are the implications of this? So it was in that E-Extreme newsletter for the what's it called, ECPR, Extremism and Democracy Standing Group. And that was one of the final discussion points in the review. Well, what are the implications of that? And that I, in my book, don't really delve into that. But sort of that one takeaway could be that, it's been sort of a misconstruement of these of the movement to call them, for instance, extreme or far right at all. I would say that no, that's not the what I would say is the takeaway as such. But there is this sort of on the ground tension that I discuss and that I highlight, which can be taken into a lot of different directions depending on A, your theoretical point of view, and B, your normative point of view, or C, your sort of political point of view, which all three of, they intermix. So it's tricky as an academic, I think, and in my position, I found it a little bit, tricky to cope with explicitly. And my approach in the book has been more or less to leave it at that with the findings. So these are the findings. This is, go down that route, which is very popular in political science. Is, well, you got to find the puzzle. You got to find so what's the conundrum here, right? What's the why question, as it were. And that's the route that I've gone down with the book, and I think it has a lot of merit to it, but you're left with a lot of questions in the end, which I think different books. If you want to answer those questions, you need to write or read different books or articles, genuinely. Yeah, so that was
great. Thank you.
May I ask the same question about the reactionary democracy? I know it has been 2 years, but I'm very curious if we have time.
Well, I mean, just because it's Lars' book event, I can answer that question, but I'd like to point it to Lars and things that he said and did. I mean, as he points out, and I so appreciate this honesty, that like things and thinking change, right? And you're also, and I think we live in a world particularly with Twitter, where people are going like, here's my article from 10 years ago, haha, I was right, haha, I was right. And you have to resist that. And I think one of the things I was afraid of was our focus on liberal racism, that the liberal approach of the far right, when, particularly at a time after January 6th, last year, obviously, when everyone goes, oh, it's fascism, it's fascism, it's fascism, people would forget about that liberalism, would forget about that, and that its role in mainstream, but its functional role within the far right. And so, in a sense, reading this book made me feel better about it. It made me feel, this book, Lars' book, obviously, made me think that this is something that is being preserved, talked about, and analyzed, regardless if boundaries blur, but particularly if we call what happened fascism. And Lars, I think, I would happen to agree, I think it is a mistake to think that is now the dominant model. I don't think liberalism had ever trumped it, absolutely. But I think that the focus on fascism and the threat to democracy, but also the counterterrorism and counter-extremism approaches, policies, rhetoric that followed it, threaten to surpass or swamp our acknowledgement or ability to see the liberalism within the far right, particularly when the far right's liberalism, I think is going to actually completely clash with the state that tries counterterrorism and counter-extremism sort of approaches on them. It was okay when it was on Muslims, right? For the far right. That was in the liberalism or authoritarianism they were willing to take. But I think it's important to maintain this analysis and this critique of liberalism, but also this ability to think differently about the far right. And again, so in a sense, that reading more work that deals with these difficult questions, like Lars' work, has actually is something has allowed me to think differently about the long view of the book and the analysis. So I thank him for that. I think the other thing is, if you don't mind me just adding, one is that after writing a book in splendid isolation for so long, and then to have COVID hit, it's a very, I don't know about you, Lars, but it's been a very strange experience. I was expecting to kind of travel, meet people, talk about the book, not be in my office 24 hours a day like I was when I was writing. But yeah, it's that's my sort of like little thoughts on that.
I hear you, Dr. Winter. So I guess suggest we can call it a day because it's almost 1.5 hours. We already have run out of our time, but it was a great, productive, for me, eye-opening session in terms of, different definitions and the topics that we're researching. Thank you so much, Lars, for the book, for your, discussion on that, and Aaron, same to you. Thank you so much. And your questions, I want to thank the audience as well. And let's meet in another panel, in another, great, amazing book talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.